Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. I'm Pablo Brito and I'm a composer and performer of contemporary classical music. On my channel I share some of my work and try to bring new music to a new audience. Today I'm very lucky to have again with me soprano Morgan Reed, who is going to join me in talking about song cycles for coloratura, voice, and piano. And today we're going to be looking at songs by Schoenberg, Webern, Richard Strauss, and also listening to some interesting recordings by past singers you may not have heard of, but I think will enjoy getting to know. So I suggest you stick around. But first, hello, Morgan. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me again.
So first, let's just talk a little bit about today's topic because it actually came up in our last video together. We talked about a piece of mine that was based on the poems of Arthur Rimbaud. And Morgan performed it together with me wonderfully. And I actually have obviously this video linked in the description box below for anyone who hasn't seen it. I do suggest you check it out. So in that discussion, Morgan pointed out to me that this was a song cycle for coloratura, voice, and piano, which really kind of surprised me because I hadn't thought of it as that. That's something that occurred basically to me after I wrote it and because Morgan pointed it out. So we thought that it would actually be interesting to talk about some other examples, basically the kind of predecessors, at the time were kind of unknown to me, of this genre, which is actually kind of a rare breed in the overall art song repertoire, which otherwise is just enormous. But this is actually a very small part of it, and it definitely allows for both more exploration by composers and performers. And we hope that we can sort of interest everyone in doing that today. And we also hope that this can be interesting to listeners of this kind of music or who may not be familiar with this kind of music. So before we get started, I just want to say, as always, if you are interested in our content and would like to see more, please do remember to like and subscribe. It means a lot to us. And also, do stick around until the end of today's video because Morgan and I actually have a little surprise in store for you. So I have to pause us right here because Morgan and I actually had so much to say about these pieces that we ended up with enough content for 2 videos. So actually, we still have a surprise for you, but it's going to be at the end of part 2. So stay tuned for that. So now I'm going to turn it over to Morgan to introduce our pieces and just give a little bit of a kind of background about this particular branch of the repertoire.
Yeah, so coloratura voice, in the way that we're speaking about it, is a voice type. So if you look at the Fach system, which is the German classification of voice types that were used for opera rolls and casting in Germany predominantly, but it's become sort of a norm that we say, oh, I am a whatever. So coloratura is not just about range, but also timbre, the color of the voice. And then there's also different adjectives you can place in front of it. So dramatic coloratura, there's light coloratura, there's what have you. So the repertoire that we're looking at today definitely encompasses a range, I would say, in terms of notes, the range of the voice that we would ascribe to a coloratura voice. So that is that it goes quite high. And this is, I would say, specific to a lot of coloraturas or people who say, oh, I am a coloratura. The repertoire sits fairly high. I mean, the thing is to point out is that we're not just talking about coloratura in the sense as just a voice type, though. These are also pieces that are just virtuosic. So you can be a whatever soprano and might have these extra notes at the top. So you might not say, oh, I'm a coloratura, but this is also where we might place this repertoire in terms of categories, as in who typically sings it and what we might be looking for when we say the tessitura of the piece, so how high and low, where it sits, and where we go from there. So these pieces aren't easy. None of these are easy. And I guess what Paolo points out as well is the piece that we did together. I would classify it as such because it does go quite high and then it does go quite low, and etc., etc. So coloratura voices, although they often are known for their high notes, they go quite low as well, and that is a very virtuosic aspect to that sort of instrument, that you can kind of encompass the full width of that range. And in pieces like this, where you're expected to jump quite high and then jump quite low, it kind of shows the full voice. And the more consistent that sound is from top to bottom, the more impressive the piece is. And you pointed out actually that this is a small segment of the art song repertory, and that's also because most art song is so focused on the text and the storytelling that it's not really about virtuosity. I mean, there are some that are virtuosic in their own sense in that way, but pieces like this that are, it's important to be this virtuosic in them, and that's kind of the point in some ways in these pieces, to demonstrate that you can do this. So these are some pieces that we picked out. Some are chamber works, then featuring this virtuosic voice type. And they highlight the text as well, and they do showcase a number of the voice's capacities. And then this is also something that has evolved in contemporary opera. There's a lot of roles in contemporary opera that end up kind of skyrocketing to these high notes as well. But it's often not overly common to have a standard set that goes to these ranges. So it's something that is quite specific and almost like a niche within the art song repertoire. So traditionally, art song duos, in the way that we think of it, is voice and piano, but of course there are chamber ensembles as well. So we do expand into that territory just a little bit with some of these examples. But we would love to hear if you have any that you think of when you think of coloratura voices or virtuosic voice ensembles or art song. So please comment below, and we'd love to see some of your examples. Maybe we'll talk about them a little bit in the future.
Yes, absolutely. So our first song is actually quite an old one that some of you may know, in the sense that it's still kind of romantic repertory. But it's very interesting in the sense that it is a song that predates anything that we could really call a song cycle for coloratura voice. Barring some very early examples that are not really song cycles and that are not really art songs. This one is a song by Rachmaninov that is definitely an art song, in the sense that it sort of is concerned with putting forward a poetic text, but it happens to be written to lie quite high in the soprano voice, and subsequently was kind of appropriated, shall we say, by coloratura sopranos, to the extent that at least in Russia and the former Soviet Union, it's actually kind of a coloratura standard. So it's this song, Zdes Khorosho by Rachmaninov. And before we get in, I guess we'll just play a little bit and show you the score, because it's interesting to see how this song can be appropriated basically by coloraturas. Heard a performance by a singer who is probably better known in the former Soviet Union, Evgeniya Miroshnichenko. And she actually, just fun fact, when I was at the conservatory in Kiev many years ago, she was actually still teaching there. She was a very well-known soprano, a very famous coloratura in the 60s, 70s in the Soviet Union. So this is kind of a classic performance in some ways. And what's very interesting to point out is this part that we heard, and looking at the score. So the most obvious thing here, right, is that very long fermata she does on the high B with something called a messa di voce, basically, which is an old word for this sort of basically starting kind of soft and getting louder and coming back. And that kind of shows the technique and the ability of control sort of in the very traditional school. And that's why she has to hold it for that long. Now, there's nothing in the score that really indicates that, but this has become standard. This is the standard performance of that moment. And really, it's almost the only, without that, there's very little to really warrant that this piece would be sung by a coloratura soprano, perhaps except for the fact that it is quite high overall, the overall tessitura, which is a term we introduced in our last video, and it's basically just where the song lies. And it does lie kind of in the upper part of the voice. So from there to the B, and then the high B, which then is expanded with the messa di voce, and also the unwritten very long portamento into the A that follows it. So then basically you have a coloratura song, basically, right? Which it is an expressive moment. It is not just virtuosity, but it is using this virtuosity in the service of this, what is, I think, a very expressive moment. So Morgan, what are your thoughts about this, about this song?
No, it's interesting you point out tradition being kind of what propels this into the coloratura, let's say, repertoire. Oftentimes, our traditions are what sort of mold these ideas of what repertoire are and can be. So there are often arias that maybe I wouldn't say, oh, that's only for coloratura voices, but then there's this lovely cadenza that's now tradition to sing quite high and then go all the way low, or what have you. So with something like this, a B in that sort of the range isn't actually that high for a coloratura soprano. So they're going to have all of that lovely control that you would want on the messa di voce in this piece, especially when you think of programming a recital. This might be something that slides in there that's almost like a warm-up for someone who might go a couple leagues higher in an upcoming piece. But this is a really good one to show the control of this part of their voice, the clarity, the tone. Like I said earlier, when we talk about coloraturas, we're also talking about timbre and color, and the coloratura voice would lend themselves quite beautifully to this. Whereas for some voices that are maybe a little bit more powerful, more dramatic, something in this range is almost in some cases the top. It's going to be the fullest of their sound, which might not suit, or would suit, but in terms of your interpretation, we might want that shiny, sparkly control right in that zone. There's also other Rachmaninov pieces that feature this high, appropriated, as you said, coloratura repertoire, and that's actually the vocalese by Rachmaninoff. A lot of people throw that in as well and kind of make a little set out of that.
Which was actually written for a coloratura soprano in that particular case, but it's sung by a variety of different.
All of the voice types.
Indeed, yeah.
So for our next piece, we'll be looking at Schoenberg's Herzgewächse, which is a performance actually by Mady Mesplé today that we'll be listening to. And this is actually an unusual piece. It doesn't exactly fit into art song voice piano duo in the way that we may have assumed, but it's so obviously for a high-sitting coloratura virtuosic voice that it's hard not to include it. So let's take a listen.
So this piece is obviously about that high F that you hear that's the part that we heard just now. But I just want to say a little bit more about Mady Mesplé. She's a very well-known coloratura singer who is better known in the kind of more traditional repertory. And I think in some ways she did do a lot of work with kind of modern and contemporary music that I think is a little bit under-recognized. Unfortunately, she passed away just this year. So I'd like to link just one little piece that's very interesting that was written for her by a contemporary composer of her time. So I will link that below. And also just talking about this piece, we haven't heard everything here, obviously in the interest of time, but the range of this piece extends to almost 3 octaves. So earlier on, she touches low G sharps below middle C. And this is a real display of range at the very least. And I think that, this kind of disparity of sort of the high and the low, I think this is something actually Morgan has a lot of thoughts about.
I actually didn't know this work at all. Pablo introduced it to me when we started talking about what we might want to talk about repertoire wise for this video, and those low notes, oh my goodness, that when I heard that I was like, oh, I would love to sing this, because I kind of, in my laundry list of things I like to do, I love singing down below the middle C. but I don't have all those high notes as clear as I'd like. And as we've heard in this recording, they're pretty crucial to the piece. But it is interesting to me because nowadays we often have some folks, and this is also the teacher in me talking, we often have singers who have a really well-developed high end and kind of shy away from that low end. That's not where they're comfortable. That's not where they feel like their sound lies, and they wouldn't even think about singing something like this. Where then you also have the flip side, someone like me who says, "Oh, look at this wonderful middle low range. I'm gonna shy away from the top stuff." So there is sort of that really interesting generation of singers where this is maybe not the norm, but they're just going to go after it and they're going to do both, and it's consistent, and that really demonstrates well taught, well practiced technique. And it's just so astonishing to me sometimes, but it can actually be quite tiring for some people. So for instance, if I sing really high in the top of my range for a while, I sometimes find it hard to bounce all the way back down.
Well,
And
that's what I want to ask you about, because you mentioned that the Rachmaninov you would have put as a kind of a warm-up piece. I'm guessing this is not a warm-up piece.
this is not a warm-up piece, but this is also something I maybe wouldn't want to end with either, because if you're feeling a little spent by the end of your program, you wouldn't want to be doing this where you're expected to go between two high and low extremes in your voice. You have to be kind of in the right headspace. It would be something that you'd particularly have to program. Maybe this is even the jewel in your program, right in the middle. You know, you're warmed up top to bottom, and you're not going to feel like you're too tense or too tired to kind of reach those two extremes. But it's a pretty incredible piece.
It is, yeah, yeah, and very unusual combination of instruments with the harp, the celesta, and the harmonium, which is kind of an organ, basically a domestic organ. Yeah, it's a very interesting piece. Not, it's a little bit kind of iconic, but not often programmed, I think, for a number of reasons that we just elucidated. But good to know, and a wonderful performance by Mady Mesplé. Speaking of kind of cult contemporary music pieces, we have in some ways the cult composer par excellence in contemporary music, and that is, of course, Anton Webern, also, along with Schoenberg, a member of the Second Viennese School. So these pieces, the next piece we're going to hear is one of the songs from his Opus 18, and this is our other kind of outlier where it's not for piano and for voice and piano, it's for voice, E-flat clarinet, which is a high clarinet, it's a small instrument, and guitar. So another very unusual combination of instruments. I'm gonna go ahead and play the excerpt now, and I think you'll see a vocal part that will surprise, that is even more sort of frightening than the Schoenberg. Let's go ahead and take a listen.
So similarly in this piece to the Schoenberg, these are some big leaps that don't always have a lot of setup in terms of leading up to it. Oh, okay, this is my high note. I'm going to breathe. I'm going to place this somewhere. It's tricky. So again, this is one that you might want to think about how you program it. You have to be in the right headspace, but it is quite virtuosic solely in the fact that it takes a lot to jump back and forth, and to allow yourself to have that freedom in your voice to do this, but also the flexibility sort of in your mechanisms of the instrument. So not allowing anything to kind of get too high up in your body, the larynx rises, or if your breath gets too high, all of those things are going to detract from what could be a really amazing display of up and down, but it's quite tricky.
It is, and my question about this piece is sort of, because the tempo is relatively brisk and there are leaps where maybe there's a rest in between, but it's literally like, you know, a millisecond, and you're singing, you know, at the very top of the range and then all the way back to the very bottom. I mean, it's really stretching the coloratura range. I think it's almost pushing the limit of what is really practicable within a good, like, let's say, should we say, a technically solid kind of vocal production. It's infinite what's possible, but you know, within a short span of time, it's very hard to like jump up and down. Sometimes you're entering on the high notes with consonants, which, you know, doesn't help. My fear with this is that it induces the singer to constrict a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, well, like I said, if it gets too high, if anything gets too tight, it's just going to take away from all of that. But one of the things you mentioned is just how fast some of it is and how short some of the pitches are. And in some cases, I almost feel like it's more percussive and it's more about tonal quality and some sort of effect rather than through sung pitch text situation. And I think because of the matching with the guitar strings and the E flat clarinet, that the voice ends up kind of lending itself to that tonal quality in this sonic world that those two instruments are creating as well, especially if it's going high, low with this more percussive quality to the voice. And it does get a little reedy. Like you feel like you're matching a little bit with this clarinet. So it kind of blends in. So in this case, I wouldn't say, oh, it's this, luxuriously legato singing with the text focus. It's more about the sonic world in some cases.
Very much. And I would say, whatever that ends up sort of forcing the voice to do, which may not be in some ways the most kind of orthodox in terms of technique, but it's acceptable within that sound world. That said, one should be careful because you don't, I would say to composers in particular, you don't want to force the singer to sort of have to kind of go outside their technique, outside their kind of placement and everything. You want to give them challenges, but not things that will kind of force them outside, and if you're not really aware of that. To be completely honest, I really don't know. It's hard to tell from looking at this piece and from what I know of Webern whether Webern wrote a lot of vocal music. He really wrote a lot, and actually, as we were preparing for this video, I found I realized how much solo vocal music he wrote. It's the largest part of his output, which is quite small because the pieces are so short, is vocal music. So he's, but I don't know how really in tune or interested or he was about the larger kind of the vocal landscape of his time, which was incredibly rich. Let's be real. So. And so actually, as a bit of a kind of sort of a counterpoint, shall we say, to Webern's kind of hyper-expressionism, I'm going to introduce here, we decided to introduce a little excerpt from a very traditional work. It's the Cadenza to an aria, frequently sung by coloraturas, also sung by mezzos nowadays frequently. So this points out in some ways your point about how coloratura, its virtuosity in the voice basically, and using that virtuosity to any number of ends, hopefully including expressive. And that's the Bellaraggio Lusinghier from Rossini's Semiramide. And we're just going to hear the cadenza sung by a very well-known soprano of the early 20th century, Amelita Galli-Curci. This is a recording made in the mid-20s. You will hear her basically traverse the same range in this very short span that we have heard that the whole piece of Schoenberg and also Webern covers. She's going to go from a high D above middle C down to a low G sharp, and then we're going to hear a high E after that. So let's play that. Not suggesting Webern knew this recording, but I do want to sort of point out that these things can be done in some ways, and some singers, this is a cadenza, she really could do what she wanted here, and she chooses to display the full extent of her range, which is impressive. So, Morgan.
Well, the high to low thing, regardless if it's a leap or this beautiful glissandi down, it is a virtuosic thing. And I keep saying this, it shows a consistent instrument, it shows good technique, it shows polish to have those notes and everything in between. So it is actually a staple to kind of throw it into your cadenza to go top to bottom and then all the way back up. And it is showing that there's no breaks, there's no gap, there's just consistent, beautiful
It's a
sound.
very fluid scale. It's actually kind of arpeggiates. So it's probably a little easier in terms of just production of sound, right? Than
Absolutely.
taking those from one to the next, but she still is covering the same range and, you know, in a very short span of time.
Absolutely. And I know for myself, when I look at a piece like the Schoenberg or the Webern, and I look at it and I say, no. I look at those leaves and I go, no, thank you. But I look at something like this and I go, oh, of course, I can sing that. Just it's just a different feeling. It's a different approach. This seems safer in a way, less vulnerable, but it also feels more free than, jumping to
Yeah,
the.
that's an interesting point. And that's what I think is important for composers to keep in mind, because singers, they would know what they're comfortable with and what they're not. But for composers to keep in mind that, you know, if you are sort of pushing someone outside of their comfort zone, it's best that you do that sort of deliberately rather than sort of by accident. I think this might be a good example of sort of the difference between that. Now, I'm not suggesting that Webern does that without knowing. I'm just saying that's kind of really pushing the singer to the limit of what they're likely to feel comfortable singing.
Yeah, a lot of singers specifically choose repertoire, like I said earlier, based on where it sits and also where it eventually goes. So we're here talking about, virtuosity in terms of high to low, but like I said earlier, a lot of people will shy away from the low. However, if you have a piece that sits high, and even if you have one solid section or one bar that showcases the bottom end, that ends up being the virtuosic aspect to that piece, that you were able to navigate everything at the top and then head all the way back down and still be comfortable down there. I think this is a very famous aria that everyone does, but De Vieni from Le Nozze di Figaro, a lot of people say, oh, well, the low note, oh, but they've navigated all this stuff at the top, but then they're like, oh, but that one low note. So it's interesting to think of it that way. It's not just the high, it's not just the low, it's navigating both of them and doing it well and showcasing both sides of the voice.
Yes, very much, very much. Yeah. Thank you so much for watching. As always, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And we will see you again for part 2.